Welcome to the Plant-Based Podcast. Did you know that plants are truly amazing? Not only can you grow them and eat them, you can also wear them, drink them, nourish your skin with them, and so much more. Let Ellen and Michael inspire you to love plants as much as they do, as they chat with the movers and shakers in this wonderful plant-based world. So, let's dig in.
Hi, it's Ellen Mary here. Just to let you know that we are currently in between Series 5 and Series 6 of the podcast, but we like to continue to fill your world with plants. So Michael and I are going solo. We've each recorded 2 episodes each that will be released on each Sunday. So first is mine and then Michael's and so on, with guests that bring topics to you that are really close to our heart. So mine today is all about gardening for well-being. I'm really excited for you to hear this episode. It was such a pleasurable chat with Jordan from Mind and Soil. So I hope you enjoy it. And next week, Michael will be here with his first solo episode to fill in that gap before Series 6 is released soon. So on today's podcast episode, we are joined by Jordan Mara, who is the founder of Mind and Soil. He's on a mission to spread the love of gardening. But I'm not going to tell you anything else because Jordan is here to tell you all about it himself. I'm really excited to hear about his journey into gardening, how Mind and Soil was born, and all about the future plans as well. So welcome so much to the podcast, Jordan.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's awesome to be here.
It's such a pleasure. I kind of came across your account on Instagram. I can't remember how now. I think it was via someone else who posted something. And I was like, oh, this is super cool. Like the more times I see accounts where someone is so passionate about gardening and well-being and getting that word out there, spreading the love of gardening and how intrinsic it is for our well-being, I am all over it. I'm like, this is excellent. I'm so excited. The more people who know about it, the better. So having you on the podcast, I'm super excited about.
Yeah, and likewise, one of the most enjoyable parts of the last kind of 12 or 13 months now of kind of building and creating Mind and Soil has been connecting with folks like yourself. And this morning I had a call with a lady in Jerusalem who is setting up a plant-based therapy kind of space and art therapy space within a nursery over there, and primarily working with kids. So it's just cool, right? That, this morning I'm speaking with somebody in Jerusalem. Now you and I are chatting and all the other connections that are out there. So certainly one of the, super kind of highlights of the past year here.
I love that. And you're absolutely right. That's something about gardening in general before we get into the nitty gritty of Mind and Soil. And that's that, if you are a lover of plants or gardening or the natural world in any way, you have something in common. And it doesn't matter where you live, what language you speak. It doesn't matter about your background. You have something in common. And that commonality, to me, is one of the most important things you could possibly have in common,
Totally. And I also have found that there's like this great level of kind of curiosity and appreciation amongst gardeners, where when you're, going through somebody else's garden or you're meeting a fellow gardener, it's very rarely a case of comparing or judgment or anything along those lines, and much more like, oh, wow, that's really neat what you did with that ground cover there. Or that's really cool how you built this trellis structure here. Or I like what you did over there. And this kind of the sharing of knowledge and information, like one creates a level of commonality, but two, in just like such a beautiful and healthy way as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a really supportive community, that's for sure, both offline and online too. So I'd love for our listeners to just find out more about you, Jordan. Tell us like how you got into gardening in the first place.
For sure, yeah. So I suppose you could say, kind of an unconventional path into gardening, and that's because it was back in around 2013, and I was going through like my first big heartbreak, and I just found myself in a really, really tough headspace, really like riddled with anxiety, and kind of to the point where like it was very difficult for me to be able to fall asleep at night without kind of, drinking myself or smoking weed in the evenings. And then I'd go to work and I would just be like blankly staring at the computer screen, my mind in a completely different space and world. And so I knew I was in just tough headspace. And there was a particular weekend in there where I went out to my parents' place, and they're both big gardeners, but it wasn't something that I did at all growing up. And so I went out there, and they knew that I was having a really tough time as well. And I went to, bed in the evening, and I literally just like tossed and turned the whole night with my cell phone in my hand, like hoping for a call, a message, something along those lines. And then there's just kind of like the painful moment of like rolling over and seeing it starting to get light outside, where you're just like, well, the night has passed and not too many Z's this past evening. So, next thing I head downstairs to make a coffee. And at some point in that morning, my mom, she comes over, she's, Jordan, how'd you sleep last night? And I shared with her, I don't think I really slept at all last night. And she just like paused in that moment, and she's like, why don't we head out to the garden for a couple minutes today? So a few hours later that morning, we went out to the garden that she was kind of working on, and she's got a pretty big and beautiful garden. And she just kind of said, why don't we build a little flower box over here? Let's bring some, soil, some compost over, bring some river rock over to build a little bit of like a retaining wall. And we'll just kind of leave it at that. And we got to work on that. I started bringing kind of like wheelbarrow full of soil and compost over to this area and the river rocks. And at some point in there, I just like so vividly remember and recall kind of standing on that path with the wheelbarrow and feeling like those clamps of anxiety that I had on my chest and on my neck for the past several weeks just loosen for the first time, and even just like ever so slightly, but to that like level or that point where I could feel like I could take a little bit of a breath and like a full deep breath and just kind of like that, like, like things are maybe going to be okay. And so for whatever reason, it clicked in my mind at that moment, like, I don't know what this gardening thing is, but I'm here for it. And I kind of knew in that moment that gardening was going to be something that I was going to take with me for the rest of my life. Although I had no idea kind of what role it would, now play in my life with what I'm, looking to build and create with Mind and Soil.
That's an amazing story, from heartbreak basically came your love of gardening. And I often, speak to people who are now big into gardening for their, positive, healthy, physical and mental health well-being. They've often found it through a hard time in their life, having never really been involved in plants or outside in nature at all. And I mean, I've told my story a few times, but I've always been into gardening since I was a kid. I mean, I was a crazy plant geek forever. But it wasn't until I was actually in my 30s when I had like a real big, like kind of life-changing thing happen to me. And all of a sudden I realized that I needed to garden. It wasn't just that I would go out and enjoy it with my parents. I needed to be out there in order to heal. And that's really when I kind of suddenly thought, wow, well, this can't be me. It can't just be me. There must be other people out there who find it just so healing, and that's when I started to look more into the well-being side of things. But there's just so many people who tell similar stories to that. There was a point in my life where something got really tough, and being outside or putting my hands in the soil and growing plants, getting that kind of the nurture experience and hope for the future really pulled me out of that really dark place. I'm sad, of course, to hear so many people say that they've been in a dark place, but also it just fills me with joy also to know that people are also finding just that connection, with gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a big part of what's happening in some of those moments, and at least, for the moment that I found myself in, is kind of this concept of time traveling, right? Where I'm incredibly anxious, I'm having a really tough time, and I'm like time traveling to a conversation that I'd be having with that individual or a moment, and like so viscerally feeling it and completely like not present in the moment. But then once you get into the garden and your hands are completely covered in dirt, like you can't be on your phone. And then you're so zoomed in on a particular plant and maybe how it's growing or where you should be pruning it, or if there's a little insect or bug or critter that you're intrigued by. And that really takes us out of this like time travel state of mind, going off to maybe a moment in the past or a future moment that we're hoping doesn't occur in the future, and brings us back into that present moment, which just feels so calming, so rejuvenating, and so restorative.
It really does. It kind of gives us the ability to focus, or to remember that we can actually focus, because, we're taught to multitask, aren't we? You should be able to do this, this, and this, and there's 3 million things that I all have to do at once, but that's got to be done. And if I just put there, I can lift that at the same time. And in your head, you go, but what have I got to do later? Because that's got to happen. Oh my gosh, I forgot to send that email. It's all that noise in your head going around all of the time. And when you're in the garden, you're just sowing a seed, or you're just thinning something out or potting it on. You can't do 2 things at once in the garden. You physically can't do them. But because of that, and you're focusing on that one task, your mind just rests, doesn't it? And we need that. We all need that.
Yeah, 100%. And, I'm not sure what it is about having just like that slight little bit of like kinesthetic activity going on. But I feel the same thing, like if I'm just weeding, or if I'm just like clearing a path, or if I'm just coloring and spending time like on the couch and just like filling in the lines and going through the coloring, even to like the point where team calls that we'll have, I like to color on them now because it keeps me more present in that conversation, rather than like my scattered brain running to some other moment while also trying to like participate in the team meeting and conversation that I might be taking part in that moment.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I completely get it. And I know that like the Japanese have one of the highest life expectancies in the world. And one of the reasons is they love to garden, but they focus very intently on one thing at a time. They're very calm. It's just one task at a time, and they're absorbed in that one task. They give everything to that one task before they move on to the next. And I'm sure that lowers your blood pressure and just calms you down and clears out all that mental craziness that goes on in our minds.
Yeah, totally. I think that multitasking, and especially with like the amount of kind of like notification stimuli that we have in our world today, it's kind of like, it's like the highway to exhaustion or something along those lines, which I'm not sure if that's a coined term, but I'm going to run with it.
You should go with it. You can use that. I'll give that one to you. You've said it on here. Now it's going to become a whole thing.
Intellectual property now belong to you.
Yeah. Okay, so how did Mind and Soil begin then? You started your journey into gardening. You found it restorative. You found it really helpful to your mental health well-being. At what point did you decide that you wanted to do something that would help other people as well?
For sure. It was a journey. And so, in 2018, at that point in time, I was kind of also in the like freelance entrepreneurial world doing sales consulting work. And I had, built up a really strong little book of business, and was kind of faced with that moment of like, the next step is to begin hiring someone and kind of growing outside of me doing all the, different things that I had to do. And it was really interesting because it was like, I didn't feel like an yes moment where it was just like, yeah, this is like for sure like the thing that I need to be doing, and I'm going to be starting it tomorrow. I like hesitated around it. And it was probably one of the first times in my life that I kind of like had the self-awareness to get curious about that. And so I was like, why am I hesitating here? Like why would I not be jumping and chomping at the bit to like begin growing this, kind of freelance or consulting business that I've gotten to this point? And so I actually ended up going in the opposite direction, and I put all of that on hold and took a sabbatical to really start thinking through like, I don't know what on earth I want to be doing with my life, or what I want that to be looking like. And so coming out of that sabbatical time, I made the decision that I was going to begin dedicating 1 day per week of my time to exploring into the mental health world and what role I wanted to play in there. And one of the things that I did that I think was really, really beneficial for me was that, I think that I let go of all the, like what's the business problem, what's the total addressable market, this, that, and the other. And on those Fridays when I was exploring into the mental health world, the only measure of success that I put and kind of like looked at or thought through was at the end of that day, am I energized? Like, do I feel energized? My soul is on fire. I could keep on working on this until 8 p.m., midnight, 1 a.m. like last night when I was recording and editing all of our YouTube videos for this week. And I use that as kind of like my benchmark or my measure of success on this exploration. And if I didn't feel fully energized at the end, I allowed myself to let go of that and begin exploring down a different path. And so I started this kind of mental health exploration journey in the technology space, right? I'd spent my life working in technology, doing sales consulting for technology companies. So I was like, maybe like where like the Venn diagram overlaps of technology and mental health, that'll be the space for me. And I noticed that on those Fridays, I was like, this is going in the right direction, but it isn't that like F yes moment, all in, I want to be doing this that I'm looking for. So I gave myself permission to let go of that. And the next thing that I looked into was nature-based therapy. And there was this really, really fascinating concept that I came across in there called attention restoration theory, and kind of like what is happening when we are immersing ourselves in nature, in the forest, or in the garden. And so I really, really connected with that element of nature-based therapy, but I didn't see myself going down the clinical path. So once again, it was like, okay, I'm going to take this little nugget and then I'm going to explore down a new and different path. And simultaneously, that's as the world started going into lockdown. And so I was just kind of like, okay, I don't know what I do next year, but I'm going to start sharing some of my gardening stories on my Instagram account. And that was all around like, can I just get a compost pile to heat up and turn into a hot compost pile? And everybody that was following me like started going wild for it. And like, I was like, why is everybody so obsessed with like seeing this hot compost pile heating up? But what I knew and noticed, and you can probably hear it in my voice right now, I was like, oh my God, I love this so much. And that's where like the kind of the dots started connecting, because I was like, okay, people seem to be loving this for whatever odd reason. And I know that for myself, gardening is what I do to kind of restore myself, to soothe myself, to calm myself, to find peace, joy, and restoration. But is that just me? It's kind of the same question that you asked. Like, am I the only person that's feeling this? And so what I did next was I set up a search anytime that gardening was mentioned alongside anxiety, stress, PTSD, grief, depression. The next thing you know, it was like story after story, article after article, research being done by the Royal Horticultural Society on just how beneficial gardening is. And then simultaneously to like kind of discovering that, we got a little bit further and closer towards the gardening season. And I started posting videos and pictures of how my seedlings were performing when they were just in like a sterile store-bought mix versus how they performed when I added my worm castings in and they were way larger. And so people were then like, how do I get my hands on some of these worm castings? And it was at that moment that it's like the Japanese concept of ikigai, where it's like what you love to do, what the world needs, what you can be paid for, and what you're good at. And at the middle of that for me was this kind of like audacious goal of trying to bring the mental health benefits of gardening and mindful gardening to 1 million individuals through like free, fun, online, entertaining education, and then the actual physical products that an individual would be needing to get their hands dirty for the first time.
It's like you've taken a huge journey in such a short space of time, actually. I know that your first kind of, you knew you felt good after going in the garden back in 2013, but just over the last couple of years, like your journey has been a big but quick journey, hasn't it?
Yeah. It's it feels like yesterday that I was on the highway where I came across, I somehow managed to get my hands on 1,400 pounds of worm castings for free, and was like in my Volkswagen, totally like the back of the car, like nearly hitting the tires on the highway back to my house. And no idea if like people would buy this or whatnot, to now, I think we've got like 1,100 or 1,200 customers already in the first like 13 months of starting Mind and Soil. So it's, like, I don't know, it's all kind of like, it's all happened fast, but under control and feels so entirely like just like the absolute tip of the iceberg in terms of the appetite for this form of gardening, and what we potentially could accomplish over the coming 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
I think the options and opportunities are endless when it comes to things like this. And I love the fact how like you would post something about your compost and everyone's like, oh no, I want to know more about your compost. I love gardeners. Like only gardeners would do that, or people who do kind of recognize, oh, that looks really interesting. I'm going to have a little go at that.
And I think that was what was really interesting, was that a good number of those individuals weren't necessarily gardeners, because at that point I didn't have a gardening channel. This is just like my personal channel, the individuals who I've gotten to know and meet through my journey of life. But I think that the way that I was presenting it was in such almost like a silly and dumb and playful manner, where I was trying to figure out like how to get the hot compost pile heating up. And so I then posted like a picture of me just like laying on top of it, hugging it. And I was like, maybe it just needs a good cuddle. And people went wild for that. And then when it finally did hit the goal temperature, I wrote like a whole poem using just like endless amounts of garden puns. Inner peas and it's on my personal Instagram account. I can't remember it now. And like opened a bottle of champagne and like had a glass for me and a glass for the compost pile. And so I think there's just something about like that very humanized side to it and the silly side to it that got a lot of people kind of curious about like, what is this gardening thing that is clearly bringing Jordan so much joy at the moment?
They must have just seen the joy in your face and in the words that you wrote about it and thought, well, yeah, what's this all about? I want a piece of this joy as well, I love that. And I love how in gardening, you at the end of the day, you're giving a serious message, but you can have so much fun with it, can't you? That all the puns and just all the laughter and all the things that go well and all the things that don't go so well, and just the community. You can just have so much fun with something that is really serious.
Like over the course of the last 7 days, and one instance in particular, like just through our website completely out of the blue, had no interaction with this individual. We received a message from someone who shared that they had come across our account, and a couple of years ago, they had lost her sister to her mental health battle and challenges. And this lady who reached out to us shared that, in that moment, she was faced with a similar, kind of just decision. Does she choose a path of destruction or does she choose a path of healing? And ultimately, she chose the path of healing and turned to gardening for that, and has absolutely passion completely sells it short, because she's now in the process of applying to get to begin her PhD and then ultimately defend her thesis, which will be around gardening's mental health benefits. And so in a moment like that, we're talking about something that's so devastating, or our communication started from something so devastating, but within the first email and messages back and forth, we're laughing, we're joking. There's a sense of kind of just camaraderie. I think of, to some degree, shared struggles, shared battles, and recognition that we all are working through our challenges respectively. And then also just an element and a level of lightness and playfulness, because that's such a beautiful contrast to the more challenging pieces.
And that's what gardening and plants can bring. And it's really, really important. It's a really good message as well to give. So I love that. Just earlier on, you said you want to reach 1 million people to bring the joy of gardening to them through Mind and Soil. So just tell us a little bit more about Mind and Soil, what that involves, and how are you going to reach 1 million people?
Yeah, that's a good question. And if you have any ideas on it, please do share them afterwards, because you've already accomplished a lot of amazing things. So any insight or suggestions from you, I'm all ears on. And it's actually one of my favorite questions to ask people, right? Is it, if you were trying to introduce 1 million individuals to mindful gardening and gardening's mental health benefits, how do you go about doing it? But I guess, yeah, but before getting to hear your thoughts, to take a quick step back, with Mind and Soil and what we're building with Mind and Soil is, truly all around how do we introduce individuals not just to gardening, but rather like that more mindful side of gardening, and that same experience that you and I both had, where it's like, man, this just makes me feel so good. It's that we want to bring to individuals, even more so than this huge pile of fruits and vegetables and herbs, et cetera. Like, from my perspective, that is a beautiful byproduct of first getting your hands dirty and just experiencing how calming, how soothing, how restorative gardening is. So the question then becomes to us, how do we help individuals have that moment, right? How are we a conduit for that same moment that you and I had experienced? And I think what's really interesting, when I reflected on my journey and that day that I spent in the garden with my mom back in 2013, I didn't have to think at all. I was basically just guided in that moment of, all right, Jordan, we're just going to bring over some soil, some compost, and some river rock. So the tasks for me were very, very simple, which meant that with gardening, there wasn't any overwhelm, not being sure if the soil blend was right, the spacing for the plants, anything along those lines. I was supported and I was guided through that initial experience. And so a huge element of, I guess, what I hypothesize we need to be doing at Mind and Soil is flattening and shortening and reducing that learning curve as much as possible, so that individuals can be tapping into it and feeling comfortable and feeling confident as quickly and as easily as possible. And the way that we would then be going about doing that is through a ton of the free education that we do through YouTube. And then we'll do happy hours where we get everybody on a Zoom meeting like this. Like, we've literally had, the biggest one had just over 2,000 people RSVP for it. And we, just chat for an hour on a specific gardening topic. And then from like a business perspective, the way that we, pay the bills is with the products that they would then be needing that, are hopefully extremely, extremely simple and kind of foolproof to be using in the garden. So that, once again, none of their time or energy is being spent on trying to figure out gardening, but rather they feel comfortable, they feel confident from the moment that they step into the garden, which then allows them to tap into that restorative side either immediately or much more quickly than if they didn't have us to guide them through it.
That's really cool. It's actually a really important message, I think, for anyone. So anyone who's new to gardening or who's been gardening for a really long time, at the end of the day, it is about just being in the moment and enjoying what you're doing. You don't have to know it all. You don't have to even know the names of the plants. Your garden or balcony or a pot or container doesn't have to look the same or better than your next door neighbors. It's just about you and the plants and being in that moment in time and just feeling that, like you keep saying, the restorative purpose of doing gardening, never mind all of the rest. And actually I was talking to somebody earlier on, and we were just saying how amazing the allotment and gardening community is online. So supportive. So it's just such a vibrant place to be. But also that can sometimes bring pressure on people because, you can meet friends and you can get so much inspiration and so much education from social media, for sure. That's definitely opened up the world of gardening. Years ago when there wasn't social media, I literally thought I was the only person in the whole world that liked gardening because none of my friends liked gardening. So that's an amazing thing. But also, there's lots of perfect gardens and perfect plants and perfect fruit and vegetables. And that can bring about some pressure. And we need to let go of all of that and just realize, just be in the moment, just be outside doing your thing, going with your own flow. That's how you feel that restorative feeling.
I could not agree more. And it resonates like very, very deeply. Because, for a first-time gardener, it could be a little bit like daunting when you just see like this beautiful harvest basket here and this perfect set of tomatoes there. And it's like in my first year of gardening, I got one tomato off of the vine and it tasted so bad. Like it tasted absolutely miserable. And that was all. Like I spent months working and I was so proud of it to the extent that I gave it to a colleague as a present, a Christmas present. And because it was like, this is like my pride and joy, only to then realize it tasted like absolutely miserable.
Do you know, I so thought you were going to say it tasted amazing. And when you said miserable, that really made me laugh so much. You know, in gardening, we always use that as an example, you know, like for growing your own food. We will always say, oh, tomatoes homegrown taste so much better than in the supermarket. Not always.
Not always. No. And I definitely had one that you would not want to, if you bought that at the supermarket, you would never go back to that supermarket. That's how bad it was. But like what happened in those first years was that I was just like, I don't care if I get 0 tomatoes off of here. I'm having I cannot wait till tomorrow morning when I get to, be on Saturday morning, pour myself a cup of coffee and just go out into the garden, be in the sun for an hour, tend to my tomato plant that doesn't yet have tomatoes and just be getting my hands dirty. And that's like we do a session, one of our happy hours all around like tips for beginner gardeners. And the very first thing that I communicate to people is like at the beginning, like start small and don't put any expectation on like yield, bounty, harvest, etc. Like focus on just like enjoying getting your hands dirty, spending that time in the garden, disconnecting from technology. And if you do that, all those other pieces are going to line up in the years to come. And I think like one of the really cool things of this past year, and this is another individual who I received an email from on Tuesday of this week, and they sent me a picture of their garden in their first year. And we have like, I don't know how many customers who this was their first year ever gardening. And they had like legitimately epic gardens of like completely full, busting at the seams. And I was like, I'm happy about this because I think it means we did something right in terms of like educating you and making sure you have the right products. But like, you should have had to work for it a little bit more.
That's not fair.
Yeah. I was like, if you knew like what my first year or second year or third year of gardening was like compared to this, like, oh my goodness, like you are light years ahead of where I was.
But I love the fact that it's always a journey. So for every individual, it's a journey. Your journey is different to, that person's journey who's basically gone into it full swing and has the most amazing garden straight away after a year. Yours will be different to that, but everyone's feelings are different. Everyone's reason for gardening is slightly different. And also I think everyone has different time. Perhaps they have different amounts of money that they can put into their garden. So don't compare to anybody else. Like that's something that I always say. I don't compare what I'm doing with anyone else. I take inspiration from it and always feel really happy as someone's got a great harvest or the garden looks amazing. But don't get me wrong, there are obviously occasions where I'm like, oh, how did you get that amazing crop when I think I'd done exactly the same and mine was rubbish this year? But there's so many variables in gardening. So just not comparing it and just being you, being yourself, going with your own flow and just enjoying the process, never mind the outcome. That's what I think.
Totally. I think, I think I heard it somewhere. It's like comparison's the thief of joy.
Yes.
I think that's entirely true.
That I completely agree with that. Now, it's slightly different, although the outcome would be the same. So I'm a veganic gardener, so I don't use any animal products on my plot, and everything is dealt with very humanely. So I don't kill pests or anything like that. And sometimes I have crops that are wiped out, and people say to me, "But how do you deal with the fact, all of your lettuce have been eaten by slugs?" I'm like, it's fine. The slugs ate the lettuce and I'm still alive and I really enjoy growing them. And so it's all good, really,
And on the slugs front, what I've found actually works quite well is that if you've got, say lettuces, they tend to like eating away at leaves, is on say like a kale plant where it's growing vertically or something along those lines. If you almost leave like 4 or 5 lower on the ground, and then start harvesting above that, but leave those 4 or 5, then it almost serves as like a little bit of a decoy from the good leaves higher up, and then they just kind of like feast away on the lower leaves. So I was doing that last year, and it ended up working fairly well for serving as a distraction to the slugs.
That's a really great idea. So instead of just sacrificial plants, you're doing sacrificial leaves. I like that.
Yeah, totally. And I'll even like, there'll be times where, like I'll leave some of it like just in the bed on the ground, because I'm like, they're here, they're going to eat away at something. I might as well make something very accessible to them, so they have a lower likelihood of getting towards the vegetables, the fruits, the leaf that I want to be enjoying.
Yeah. That's a great idea. That's a great idea. So, with regards to kind of mindful gardening, how do you have any tips for like how, if you're going out in your garden tomorrow, so someone listening to this is going to have some time to go out in their garden tomorrow, you will receive so many well-being benefits just from being outside doing it. But do you have any tips that are specifically kind of useful for kind of specific tasks that will create that lovely mindful gardening experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's use that example of, an individual kind of going out to their garden for, one of the first times. And what I would encourage them to do is to spend a couple of minutes before even going out there to just kind of understand like what it is they're looking to accomplish. And so let's take like Jordan from many years ago growing tomatoes and what I could or should have done a little bit differently. Like I didn't look up any like say YouTube videos beforehand to understand like how do tomatoes grow? What do they need in order to not taste like complete rubbish? And so if I were to go back to that point in time, what I would have done is the evening before spent a little bit of time just YouTubing around like, how do I go about growing tomatoes? So that I then, when I got into the garden the next day, have a bit of a feel for what it is I'm looking to accomplish while I'm out there. So a little bit of kind of like knowledge, education before heading out into the garden. Now, when we get to like that morning of then going out into the garden and beginning the gardening session, my like absolute hands down by a landslide favorite thing to be doing to kind of begin that gardening time is just like to sit on my back steps with something warm to drink for a couple of minutes. And I try to count how many different sounds I can hear. And when we think about mindful activities, it's all about driving into the present moment. And what's so amazing to me every time that I do that is that like, I think that I'm like, in the present moment. And so like, I hear the car drive by, and then I hear like, maybe like a horn down the street, and then I hear like a door close. But then you start to hear like this bird that just flew overhead. And then you start to hear the river 2 blocks away, and it just kind of like gently rustling. And then you hear the wind moving through the trees. And this practice of trying to hear how many unique sounds, it really forces you into that present moment. And what I venture to guess will happen for the individual that does this is they'll like within 5 minutes of being in the garden be like, oh dang, like I'm moving a little bit more slowly. I'm already feeling like a little bit more peaceful, a little bit more calm. And then, so from there, it could be that, you're working on that, kind of like gardening task that you had, right? So tending to that tomato plant, or if it was something different. But if you wanted to just continue to layer in more kind of mindful gardening elements, I would think through kind of like what other senses can I be activating while I'm in the garden? So we think about, say, scent. And this is probably one of the coolest parts of the garden is that like there are so many amazing different scents in the garden. And so once you spend a little bit of time working away on your tomato, rub a couple of those leaves and
No.
How come no?
No, I can't stand the smell of tomato foliage.
Oh no. I almost prefer the scent of tomatoes to the taste of tomatoes. It's such a beautiful smell. Oh,
no. Isn't that funny? You? Sorry, carry on. That just shows, doesn't it, how personal like your senses are, like your smell and your sight, what you really appreciate, kind of looking at what scents that you really enjoy, the sounds and that kind of thing.
What about lavender then?
Yes, I love lavender.
There we go. Perfect. So yeah, like what I would be doing is I would be going around from like, one plant to the next and just kind of like touching the leaves and then smelling that all the way through, like grab a little bit of the soil and smell the soil. Because again, it's bringing you into that present moment, and just enjoying that time and having that time slow down. One of the other senses is touch. So on top of scent, touch. And one thing that I'm going to be doing this coming season that I'm really, really excited for is building a kind of like a sensory activation path where every 15 feet of the path, it's going to be a different texture. So as you walk into the garden, the first 15 feet will be something like moss. And it'll be like really soft, almost like a carpet. And then the next 15 feet is going to be like wood chips. And then maybe the next 15 feet will be really like small pebbles. And then maybe grass after that. To again, be feeling each of those to kind of different textures and the contrast from one to the next as you move from the first 15 feet to the next 15 feet. So those would be a couple of the ways that I would go about incorporating mindfulness into the gardening session.
I love that. Thank you so much for those tips. And I'm sorry about the tomato foliage, but I love your path idea because actually
you almost got my first cuss out of me on the by that.
I do like to try and
Michael Proud.
At the beginning of the podcast, I always say to our guests, we don't edit this at all, but if you do cuss, then our editor will like beep you out. And then throughout the podcast, I just like to provoke a little bit, because I want to get a beep in there and it not be me.
Does Michael think that's a rule?
Boom. I love that. The path idea. I've been to a few gardens where they have different textured pathways for children to play on. So there might be kind of a wood chip area and then a stony area and then an area for shells, that they can walk on and the crunch beneath their feet and they can pick that up and feel it. But I love going out into the garden with bare feet. And earthing yourself and getting all of that lovely, great energy from the earth and absorbing that into your body and kind of bringing yourself into balance is one of the most beautiful things to do. So the idea of maybe kind of stepping onto some moss and then stepping onto something like chamomile and then maybe just kind of a grassy area, I think that would be absolutely lovely. Absolutely lovely.
Yeah. And I think what's important to note for that individual that's on the newer side to gardening is we're not talking about how to, prune this plant for maximum growth, but what is very likely to happen is that all of those elements start to begin to happen in the background because you love your time in the garden so much. And so then you're looking for new and more ways to be spending more and more time in the garden. And so subsequently, the bounty, the harvest, the yield tends to increase year over year because you want to be spending just more and more time in that garden. So that's again why I think it's such an amazing way to focus on those kind of mental health benefits and approaching it from a mindful perspective to ultimately become a really, really strong gardener.
Yeah, I love that approach, actually. I think a lot of people go into it wanting the crops and kind of that end result without thinking about the process of being mindful, and the crops will come. So I love that message. Now, before we finish up the podcast, this has been really good fun and really interesting, and I know our listeners are going to love it. What are your plans for Mind and Soil for the future? Do you have anything that you kind of, apart from reaching 1 million people, which is absolutely amazing, and I know you're going to do it. You have so much passion and enthusiasm. Is there anything that you're kind of planning on for Mind and Soil?
I will dive into that, but first I want to hear your thoughts on what would you do to try and introduce mindful gardening to 1 million individuals? How would you be going about it?
This is a great question that I had not prepared for in any way.
The turntable.
Yeah, I know. Hang on, this is my podcast. What would I do? I think, first of all, it depends on whether you want to actually reach out to individuals on a one-to-one basis or if you're happy just to get the message out there online. Social media has given us so many more opportunities. And I said earlier on about opening up that world. You can reach everyone in the world via social media. We know, YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and everything's just... it's blown up, hasn't it? Especially even more so over the last few years. So that's a great way of reaching them. But I think your message there, what you've just said, about approaching gardening in a mindful aspect rather than an outcome aspect is probably the most important tool in your box, so to speak, because I haven't actually really ever heard anybody say that before. It's almost always, oh, you want to grow lovely tomatoes that will make you feel really satisfied. Or, you know, when you take your crop of courgettes home, you're going to feel really happy that you've done that. But you're stripping all of that back and you're going back to the very beginning, which is actually, this is about you and your mental health. The rest will come. So that message is key. So I would say in everything that you do, I would particularly focus on that, because it takes a whole lot of pressure out of gardening. It makes it a bit more accessible for people. And those who aren't interested in gardening yet, but are perhaps suffering with mental health in any way, will think, oh, so maybe I can do this. So it isn't all about growing the best tomatoes. It's just about the process of being outside and helping myself. So to me, I think your key message to reach as many people as possible is that, because I often find online you're preaching to people who already know that gardening is great, you know, like me too. Like I'm on there and most of the community are gardeners, so you're already telling the people who already know gardening is great. So it's trying to kind of hook in others who don't really know just yet what gardening is about and are maybe slightly put off by the idea of gardening because they don't have enough space, because the media portray that gardening is really about big gardens and formal lawns and perfect vegetables. You buy perfect vegetables in the supermarket, but that's not the reality of gardening whatsoever. They come in all shapes and sizes. So stripping it right back and your message being it's about you, not the tomato, you know, I think is probably the key to reaching so many more people.
That was a very beautiful response. I really, really appreciate that. And it's really like reassuring to hear it in that way, because you nailed it on the head in that, you know, we could go out there and share, you know, general gardening messaging, because that's going to, like, people are familiar with that. But in reality, it's those individuals that haven't yet even gotten their hands dirty, that I'm even more interested in connecting with and introducing them to it. And I think that you put it beautifully, that it's almost a more gentle entry to gardening, with probably like a higher likelihood of success as well. So I really appreciate those thoughts.
It's a total pleasure. And it's been such a pleasure having you on the podcast as well. And I absolutely know our listeners are going to love this episode and go back out into their garden with a slightly different approach to how they're gardening, which I think is really, really important. So before we finish up, where can listeners connect with you? Where can they find you online and learn more?
For sure. And sorry, because I hijacked the podcast there for a minute there. Do you want me to answer that question in terms of kind of what's on the horizon for us?
Oh, yeah, I do, actually. Thank you for completely being in control of my podcast with me not knowing what I'm doing whatsoever.
But Michael sent me the list of questions, so. So, you know, I'd say thematically, coming back to one of the things that I mentioned earlier, right, is, you know, how do we make this as easy as possible for an individual to, you know, kind of begin or be exposed to, and kind of like, again, reducing that learning curve as much as possible. And so what we did in, you know, up until now has really all been around, like, here is like kind of individual educational pieces. And then here are like individual soils. And what we're doing this year is essentially combining those two pieces together into gardening kits that come with everything that an individual would be needing in order to be getting their hands dirty. So like, as an example, just this past weekend, we launched our seed starting kit, and that comes with a grow light. It comes with 5 packs of seeds from West Coast Seeds, who we work really, really closely with. It comes with a 10 by 20 tray plus 18 seed cells that go in there. And it comes with my favorite watering device, which is a turkey baster. And then that gets shipped to the individual right to their door. They're going to be able to start seeds that exact day with everything they have. On top of that, they get multiple videos from us on exactly how to go about starting those seeds so that they can be successful, as all those individuals were that I alluded to this past year and had those amazing kind of like first year gardens. So in the very short-term future, what we're moving towards is like, again, kind of like that gardening kit concept, to make it as easy as possible for an individual to start gardening. And then like way down the track, 7-8 years, I think the dream for me is to have a space, like multiple acres, where we run Mind and Soil, but is also set up kind of as like an Airbnb or a homestead type of accommodation, where individuals who may not have garden space, may not have experience gardening at all, can come to us, stay with us for a weekend, get their hands dirty, and feel firsthand exactly kind of what it is that we're preaching about when it comes to mindful gardening. So that's kind of the long-term vision that I've had for where Mind and Soil goes.
That sounds completely amazing. Do you know what I want you to do right now? I want you to turn around and write that on that whiteboard behind you. So let me just explain. There's a whiteboard behind Jordan. And just before we started to record, I said, that looks like a very organized whiteboard. And he said, I haven't really added to this or done anything on this whiteboard really for absolutely ages, months. And when he turned and looked at it and read a few things off there, he's completely and utterly smashed those goals. So I think that goal needs to go on that whiteboard, and then you have to make it happen.
Just gotta find a marker with some.
Can't even find a marker. That's how long ago it was used.
It hasn't been used in so long that it's dead.
Here we go. It's going on the board.
There we go.
And that's a goal for the future, which is really exciting. It sounds amazing. And of course, that's the most incredible way to reach people on a one-to-one basis as well and get them into gardening. So I do wish you all the best. I'm not going to wish you luck because I don't believe in it. I think that you have completely got this. It's been a real joy to chat with you. And where can listeners find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me as well. It's been a lot of fun just chatting here for the last little while. And so, yeah, if anybody is curious about, getting their hands dirty or joining us on kind of this little journey and adventure that we're on, the two best places to find us are on Instagram, which is just at Mind and Soil, and then on YouTube, which is just youtube.com/Mind and Soil. And we're very, very active on both of those. So those would be the two places.
Great. So if you're listening to this, go and follow Mind and Soil, follow the journey, and let's just all get into more mindful gardening. Never mind the pressure of how it's going to turn out. Just enjoy being in the moment. And I think that's most definitely the message that's been given on this episode today.
Absolutely. Take those expectations and throw them in the rubbish, as you'd say over in the UK.
Put them in the compost.
I was thinking.
Or compost, as you say in the US. Thank you so much, Jordan.
Thank you.
The music for the Plant-Based podcast is part of the song Grow by Mikey James, and our editor is Gareth Patch of Semi Echo.